welcome back to the Video Essay Podcast. I'm your host, Will DeGravio. Regular listeners of this show will remember that at the end of March, I had a conversation with Alison Peirse, who led the project Doing Women's Global Horror Film History, a year-long video essay mentoring and training program that culminated in a really groundbreaking videographic special issue of MAI, Feminism and Visual Culture. Doing Women's Global Horror Film History features the work of 30 contributors working on women's horror filmmakers in non-anglophone countries, with a particular focus on filmmakers from the global majority. In that conversation, Alison and I discussed the origins of the project, the contributors and the mentors who worked on the project, how the video essays relate to existing scholarship on women horror filmmakers, and much more. We also teased that our conversation would not be the last mention of Doing Women's Global Horror Film History on the Video Essay Podcast. Today, I'm very excited to share the first of several conversations with creators who worked on the Doing Women's Global Horror Film History project. Today's episode features a conversation with Krista Calvo and Colleen Laird, who are two film scholars who created works as part of this project. We had a really fantastic conversation. 50 minutes was not nearly enough time, but it's really fantastic to hear more about the process that went into creating these videos. You can learn more about the project and the videos discussed on today's episode in the description below. And as always, you can learn more about the Video Essay Podcast at thevideoessay.com and subscribe to our free newsletter, Notes on Videographic Criticism, at thevideoessay.substack.com. Now, here's my conversation with Krista and Colleen. Now I'm so pleased to be joined here by Krista and Colleen to talk about their contributions to, this Doing Women's Global Horror Film History. Krista and Colleen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us. Yep.
Oh, yes. And so Colleen, I know IRL. But Krista, I've never had the chance to meet you before, and obviously I got to encounter you a little bit through your work. But I'm curious, could you just briefly introduce yourself, kind of to the audience, and just kind of your work more generally as a scholar in horror?
Yeah, of course. So it's actually quite refreshing to hear your guys' accents, because I lived in New York for 10 years. I grew up in the States, and I've been living in England for 6 years, and now I'm just like, oh my goodness. You guys aren't English weird. But yeah, I mean, the reason I came to the UK was to go to uni, and I've studied a bunch of different things, but I ended up doing a PhD in horror studies, more leaning toward film theory, but I have a background in forensic science. So I kind of melded those two things together when I was writing my thesis, which is my focus has always been on childhood and children's studies. No matter what I've studied throughout my life, I've always kind of focused on that. And I just decided I was actually working with, unfortunately, real children's cases in the forensic context, and it was just too much for me. So I was like, no, thank you. But how can I sort of take all of this stuff that I've, learned and picked up and translate it into looking at it through a horror lens? And so I did my PhD research on children in horror films in from the 1980s, so like Reagan era horror. I was very much looking at like the politics of the time and how this, all of the stuff like Stranger Danger and Satanic Panic and how that might have been reflected in the horror films of the era. So I watched stuff like, The Gate and Monster Squad, but I also went a little bit more obscure and did analyses on movies like Bloody Birthday. So it's been a good time. I'm sort of branching out my research a little bit now. I've gotten really into action films, more like the action films that sort of toe the line of horror. But yeah, for now, I'm still working in that like children in horror sort of wheelhouse with my research. So
Fantastic. And I'll be excited to hear more about how that kind of fits into your to the video essay you made. But yeah, Colleen, could you
Oh,
give us
yeah.
the same
Hi.
intro?
Absolutely. My name is Colleen Laird. I'm an assistant professor of Japanese cinema at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. My specialization is on Japanese women directors, specifically contemporary directors who work in commercial cinema. Um, Not very many of them make horror films, although there are a couple. But when I originally went to graduate school, I proposed working on J horror, which was sort of in vogue at that time, more than a decade ago. And it was to, I think, my advisor's great disappointment that I veered off course from horror. That was his thing at the time too, to work on women directors. Although he fully supported me later in that endeavor. So it was really a pleasure to be invited to be a part of this project, so that I could return to some of those previous interests. I do teach on J horror, and I advise a lot of there's a lot of student interest in horror, and so many of my graduate students are fairly invested in Japanese horror as well. So it's always been there for me, but this was the first time I really got to sink my teeth into it in any way.
Fantastic. And fun to see all these scholarly through lines coming together.
Yeah.
And Krista, I'm wondering for you, like, what was your experience or like exposure generally to kind of the video essay, either in like a scholarly context or even just kind of in the online film culture world, or culture world more
yeah.
generally?
Yeah, so I didn't have much experience with it. It was quite a new thing to me. I think one of my first experiences with it, I feel like there's this they have a podcast and a website, it's Polyester. And they dabble in like video essay type stuff, but it's more like very pop culture, topical stuff. Like they talk about the Kardashians, but it's really reflective of like it's not gossipy. And that was kind of the only type of thing I had seen. And then when I saw Allison's call for papers, I started looking more into it, and I was like, oh wow, this is actually really cool. And I think it sort of really spoke to me because I'm such a visual learner, and like I feel like, I have autism, so it's like that's just the key way that I can learn. And I just thought about all of these times I've spent sitting in classrooms and just not computing anything because it's all just yapping, right? And I was like, I moving into academia, like I would love for this to be a way to teach my students, because I guarantee there's so many other students out there like me who learn in that way, who are super visual. And I know that like a lot of our projects were very artistic in nature, but I still think there is, that academic and educational takeaway from it. And I have a hard time picturing things when I'm reading an academic article, especially about cinema. And I'm like, but being able to see it and read the accompanying paper, I was like, whew, it just kind of changed my life. So I was like, I have to learn how to do this, for me to know, and also to kind of use as a tool in my, as a professor as well. So it's awesome.
That's fantastic. And so had you had any like editing experience, like video editing experience before? Like how did you find the process of like, because there's almost like a type of, maybe, I don't know if like translation or adaptation of like scholarly, you have to think about moving your scholarly practice into like a new realm. So like what was that like for you?
It was really, really interesting. So I had never done anything beyond making a reel on Instagram of me and my boyfriend's holiday. Like that was as far as I had ever gone. but I'd always kind of had an interest in it. Just not necessarily the academic video essay, but just, playing with editing tools and editing software. Like, I used to play around with like animation stuff, and but that nothing. I kind of started out at zero, and I feel like I sort of translating, the way I think academically, and using it in that like visual creative space was, it felt really liberating in a way, because I felt like I could communicate so much more easily through piecing and sewing these images together to kind of tell my story. It almost feels like, I've been told I talk a lot and I over explain. And I think it's because I'm like, well, I just want to make sure that you understand. Whereas with the video essay, I was like, oh no, look, here it is. I don't have to explain it to you that much. And I really love that element. So I feel like that translation kind of happened seamlessly, but it was rough at first. It was difficult to pick up, but
Absolutely. Yeah, because right, it's that balancing of just, thinking like all the critical things, but then also just the wait, which buttons do the thing that I want it to do, right?
yeah,
It's
yeah.
all the things. Like it's just, it's very a wide spectrum. And yeah. Colleen, and I'm wondering if you could, discuss like kind of how the process of working within the context of this project was for you, and kind of take us, how this fits into kind of your existing practice.
Yeah, so by the time I joined this project, I had dabbled just a little bit already in videographic scholarship. So it was my distinct privilege and honor to attend the scholarship in sound and image workshop on videographic criticism at Middlebury College in the previous summer. So that would have been in 2022. Yeah, yeah, time flies. So 2022, which is where I met you, Will, right? You were the TA for the workshop that year. And so I had run through what are called the Middlebury exercises in that workshop, and at the end of it had produced my first piece of videographic scholarship, which was later published in Transition. So that was a really powerful experience for me, and it completely revolutionized the way that I think about scholarship and my investment in what I want to do moving forward. That's also where I met Alison Peirse, who was part of my cohort. So coming out of that experience, Alison was already, I think, a quarter of the way through this project, and she reached out to me at the end of the summer and said, we'd become friends at that point in time. And she said, hey, because of your interest in women in film, and also because of your interest in horror, would you like to join this initiative? Because it was still in the early stages yet. No one had really met to go through any of the exercises or do any of the training. So I said, sure, absolutely. I was all in, I was completely hooked on making video scholarship. And so I joined from there. So it was like I had just gone through the exercises, and then the project, you ran through the exercises as well. So it was sort of like a second issue for me of going through these again, which in some ways, it's sort of like having a little bit of a leg up because I'd done it before. The skills training wasn't new to me, but it was a nice refresher in rethinking about how to do things rhetorically in this form. So I was very grateful for that experience to run through the process again, and to be able to think about something, knowing what was coming down the line because I've been through it before. So a little bit of a different interaction, but it was really great to be able to join this group. I don't know if that's top secret information that I joined in that way, but it's out there in the world now. Nepotism.
Listen, it's already published.
There we
it's
go.
over. But no, it's in watching your video made for this piece, or made for this special issue rather, we see so much of your work come together, which is, this focus on women filmmakers, Japanese horror. And then in reading your statement for the piece, you kind of begin by walking us through this, this very personal encounter. And I'm wondering if you could just elaborate here. And I very much associate that kind of personal with a lot of the stuff that you've made. And I'm wondering if you could just talk about how you arrived, at how you went about choosing a film to work with, and kind of what your process was that you wanted to take us down this route videographically?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions packed into
Yeah,
one.
sorry, I do that.
No,
Yeah.
it's great. It's great. Um, maybe I'll start from the end and work my way backwards.
Go for
So,
it.
the clear choice, I think, when you're working with Japanese horror and you're thinking about women filmmakers would be Asato Mari, who works almost exclusively in the horror genre, and she's quite famous. But there was already somebody who was working on Asato Mari, so that I didn't have that option. And I almost went with Ninagawa Mika, who also has made some films that you could think of as horror or horror adjacent. Um, Diner certainly is a horror film. But I just done something on Ninagawa, so I wanted to choose somebody different. And I was at the time teaching horror, or I had just finished a horror class. I can't quite remember. And I had shown Kurosawa Kiyoshi's film Loft. Um, and the reception to that film in my class was, let's say, not optimal. The students really hated it, but I liked it. I liked it, and I was trying to think of why, and I went online and I read, several reviews about this film, and sure enough, the general consensus is that it's not great. And in fact, one of the exercises that I almost did was I wanted to create a karaoke version of this reviews and put them to music and like have a bouncing dot and everything, just to highlight the difference between public opinion and my obviously much more informed scholarly opinion, which is obviously correct. Um, but then I thought, I want to explore why, why is there something happening with this film? And Kinoshita Chika, who's a scholar of Japanese cinema in Japan, wrote about this film in the context of J horror and the J horror movement, and specifically Kurosawa Kiyoshi is one of the key members of this movement. And it was actually from talking with her later and reading her piece that I learned about Ashizawa Akiko, his cinematographer for this film, and frequent partner. So she works with lots of directors, not just with Kurosawa, and she works across a great number of genres as well. But she did get her start in horror film, specifically pink horror film, so that's softcore pornography horror, and then has worked a lot with Kurosawa. And so this was their first film together, I think. And in working with her, Kurosawa wanted to sort of explore a more female, put that in air quotes, like female approach to narrative and to subject position in horror. And so teamed up with Ashizawa and was like looking for this kind of female lens through a cinematographer. And I think that maybe it actually comes through in a way that I appreciated from my subject position as a spectator that many of my students didn't. So I think there's something gendered in the reception there, and also of the online critiques. So that's how I decided on the film. That's how I became interested in learning about Ashizawa. I was in Tokyo midway through this project, and I was in the library and I was reading interviews with her, and that's how I discovered this piece that she wrote on her favorite films. And just as I wrote about in the commentary, it was at this like intersection of having conversations with my friend and then being in the library and sort of having this mental conversation with Ashizawa on paper, and then also the opening epigraph for the video essay is Daisuke Miao, but he's my second PhD advisor from back in the day. So it's also like an ongoing conversation that I've had with him as well on a personal level. So I wanted to bring all of these together in the video. And I'm talking quite a lot here, so feel free to truncate it as you wish. But on the last note, I've been thinking about this quite a bit, and it's about the more personal tone of writing the creator's commentary or the short essay that goes with video essays in the scholarly context. Um, and I've been thinking a lot about, not just why do we make videographic criticism, but why do we consume it, or what makes us want to watch one piece as opposed to another, or why would you want to watch this? What makes you want to watch it? Not necessarily as an entertainment aspect, but just like making it worth someone's while to put their eyes and ears on this thing that I've made. And then in thinking about that quite carefully when I put something together, also thinking about the commentary, like why would you want to read this, right? It's short. Is it informative? Is it just providing context for the video? Like a lot of people will sometimes watch the video, but they won't read the commentary. So I've been thinking a lot about like, how do I make the commentary worthwhile for somebody's eyeballs, for somebody to read? Um, and in thinking about that, like what can the form of the short piece of commentary provide us as scholars as a new way of expressing ourselves, as something other than the long form article or the monograph? Like I don't want to just redo what we've already done in print scholarship. What can we do that's different? And of course, like the personal there, right? But also creating a narrative, crafting a story, which is something that we're not often allowed to do, right, in those other venues. So I experimented with that in this piece, and subsequently for other things that I put out there for consideration, I've continued to kind of push that a little bit more. So I'm pretty invested in that.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And we'll dive into that more because I have questions about kind of how the written statement and the video are really interacting and in conversation with one another. But for Krista, I'm kind of interested in kind of the same question for you. Like, how did you arrive at, how did you approach trying to think through a potential topic for a video essay? How did it maybe change as you were working on it? Like, yeah, just walk us through kind of your thought process there.
Sure, yeah. I feel like for me, I've kind of always, no matter what project I'm doing, I really, really want to enjoy doing it. So my first question is always pick three things that I really love and how do these weave together, right? And so when I saw Allison's call for applicants, I was like, I obviously like my wheelhouse is children and childhood and horror. But I wanted to do, because it was like doing women's global horror, I was like, I would really love to write about my own culture. It's like my family's Central American, we're part Mexican and Belizean. And I was like, okay, well, here's two things. But does this exist? Like, I didn't want to do, I mean, I know it's a beautiful film, but I feel like so much attention has been given to Isa Lopez and her film Tigers Are Not Afraid. And I was like, I kind of want to move away from that. I really want to look for a multi hyphenate who not a lot of people have heard of. I really want to give her a platform, whoever she may be. And I'm a huge fan of stop motion animation. Like, I love stop motion, it's one of my favorite things. And I just put in some keywords and I found Sofia Carillo, and I watched all of her shorts that you can find online, and I just absolutely fell in love with her. And she just like, she hit all the notes. And I think I almost like created sort of like, it was like the fire just burned really quickly, where I was like, how have I never heard of this person before? I'm obsessed with them. They're my new favorite person. Like, I just want to know everything that they've ever done and read everything about them ever. And I got a little bit obsessed. Um, but I think it was just sort of that, me trying to find like the perfect formula of like something that I would really enjoy investigating. And it turns out that like her stories, which is something I explore in my video essay, but all of her shorts in some way or another sort of tell on each other. Like, they all explore really similar themes, but the differences between them are so nuanced. And she's such an intricate storyteller, and most of them don't have any dialogue, which I really, really love, because it's just so reliant on the animation and the story that she's telling. And I think because there's no dialogue, you can really relate to it in a different way. And I think for me, I started seeing those bits and pieces of culture, my culture, showing up in like the way that her female characters behave, and how that's sort of like reflective of stigmas around, stereotypes around like Latino women, and her kind of sort of turning that on its head. And yeah, I was like, this is perfect. And she does this beautiful thing in a lot of her shorts, where she's always exploring like the feminine and femininity, but she also likes to explore the child within, the grown up woman. So like, she'll depict them as like little sisters, but really it's your inner child and all of that stuff. And I just thought it was so beautiful, because I feel like a lot of times, like, for Latinas in culture in Central and South America, women are sort of we're really taught to sort of push that emotional side down, which I think kind of backfires, and that's where we get that, stereotype that we're loud and we're wild and we're crazy. But I love that she explores that, because it's not seen a lot in a lot of stuff that comes out of Latin America. And again, it's something Isa Lopez does really well too, but I thought, oh, I love Sophia. I want everyone to see her. So yeah, my process was really just, I don't know, I kind of plucked it out of the air, and I think I manifested it. I was like, this must exist somewhere. And I think it was really nice too, because a stop motion animation, especially in the horror short format, it doesn't get a lot of attention at all. I know that film Stop Motion just came out. I'm really excited to see it, but it's very rare that it gets scholarly attention. And so I thought it was like the perfect storm. I can give attention to a multi-hyphenate female creator that just is doing something completely different. So yeah, not much of a process, more of a vomit, an explosion of something that happened, and then I made my essay. So
That's fantastic. And I'm wondering, so your video employs a multi-screen, split screen approach, kind of like how I'm looking at you two right now. Um, and you use this, as you say in your statement, to kind of stage this you know dialogue between the images, the characters in the films, kind of the sense of history, this telling, as you say. And I'm wondering how you arrived as that, as like how you decided you wanted to use that kind of rhetorical audiovisual approach of the split screen, and how you see it functioning in your piece.
sure. So when I was originally brainstorming how I wanted to present it, I was just doing one frame, and there was just something really, really missing. And I started seeing, I was trying to use a third of her films called Fuera de Control, and I couldn't get a good quality version of it online. Everything was just, it was too low. It was just really, no matter what I did to it, I just couldn't use it. And so it kind of happened a little bit by accident, because I had all my screens open, and I'm like going through it, picking parts out, yada, yada, yada. And then I had Fuera de Control open on YouTube in my browser. I know YouTube is like possessed. Sometimes videos just start playing. And it started to play, and I realized that the soundscape from Fuera de Control, like, it just fit over what I was watching, and like, jumping around in the scenes. And it was just in that moment, I was like, what if I just did all of it at the same time, so you get the full immersive package, and you're experiencing three of her shorts in one moment. And then that's when I started weaving them together and sort of seeing how they correlate, and how she will tell the same story in different ways, but then in similar ways she'll tell a different story as well. And so it just kind of happened like that. It was like just a lovely eureka moment, and I just married them all together. And I thought, if I'm going to introduce people to her, I want them to have all of her at the same time. And so I was like, let's do all three. Fuck it. Sorry. Let's go.
Swearing's encouraged.
Okay,
um,
awesome.
that's so fantastic to hear. Colleen, it's like I want to ask you a bunch of follow-up questions, so I'm trying to I need both of you for several hours.
Could I respond to what
Yes,
Krista just
please.
said, though, actually?
Please, yes.
Yeah, so when I watched your video, Krista, I was also thinking about this juxtaposition through multi-screen. And whenever I watch multi-screen, I sort of pay weirdly equal as much attention to the images that I'm being shown and what I'm not being shown, right? So I think about the negative space or the black space if it's there, and I'm like, okay, why am I looking at the black space, or why is the black space there? And with the way that it's very simply arranged left and right channels in a way, but because of the setup of the child who falls asleep and the adult who wakes up, I was thinking a lot about the in between space, which is the dream, right? We might think of like this is the role of fiction, is the in between space between falling asleep and waking up, and I felt a little bit mesmerized by the negative space that happens in your video, because I was thinking of it as like one eye sort of like sleepily opening and then the other one eye shutting. So it's like sort of this like nice dream space that was cultivated through kind of like these eyes sort of opening and shutting in a way. So I don't know. That was my experience watching it
I love that
the
because
way that
I
was
that
set up.
was sort of my intent. I wanted it to be as dreamy as possible because her films are very dreamy. Whether it's like a nice dream or it's an absolute nightmare, it all feels like you're sort of moving in that dreamlike space. And so I kind of tried to do her work justice by emulating that in my video essay. So the fact that you said that, I'm like, amazing. That makes me so happy. Thank you.
Oh, yay. Well, good. Wonderful. Will, go
And
ahead. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
no, please. I want this. I want to step back as much as possible. So please, the two of you, like, go back and forth.
I
Um,
actually do want to say something actually before
yes,
I
go ahead.
forget. So, Colleen, you were talking about how, the way that you wrote your accompanying essay, and how, because I loved your essay. I just loved how personal it was. I loved the little anecdote at the beginning. And I think one of my biggest things, why I A, love the video essay, B, love the accompanying statement, and see, I think in a lot of my work that I've been doing, I really love the accessibility of it to absolutely everyone because so much scholarship is just unreadable for the everyday person. And I'm not saying it's like, oh, because we're so smart. I feel like we feel obligated to write in a certain way where, for if I gave it to my boyfriend, he's in tech, he's absolutely brilliant, he has no idea what the heck I'm talking about. And I would love, the way I write now, I'm trying to make my writing more accessible. Do the journals love it? Not really, but to me, I'm like, if I can introduce this work to someone who will love it as much as I do, that's all that really matters to me. So I love your writing style, and I just think that, for me, accessibility is so important, when we're creating things. And I thought your essay was like exactly that, and I was like, oh, I wish everybody would write like this. Like, so yeah, I love that.
That's really kind. Thank you. That's overly kind. Thank you very much. Oh,
It's
goodness.
true though. And you're gonna get this, Will. Like, this is the problem with us who worked on this project. We are just like all obsessed with each other, and we're just gonna sit there like, you're amazing. Like, we used to do it in like class, in our, meetings all the time. Like, it gets really obnoxious how much we love each other and each other's work.
I love it. I can't get enough of it. I'm excited.
Good
No,
feels. Yeah.
I need the good now. I need the good feels, and I'm glad that I get to experience it kind of secondhand here. But Colleen, going back to this idea of, I don't know if I'm struggling to find the right word, but like I'll go with authorship, and it's probably not the right word that I'm looking for here. But in your piece, we get all of these different voices, right? Like we get your actual voice in which you you actually embody. Sorry, what's the cinematographer's?
Ashizawa Akiko. Yeah.
Akiko, yes. You embody her by reading her writing, correct? And
Yeah.
and then you also, it really struck me in the bottom of the screen. You attribute that to her, or like in the right corner of the screen, you attribute that to her, and then later in the piece, you attribute a story to yourself, and you have your own name appear there after some text on screen has played. I'm wondering if you could just discuss how you approached having all these different voices, and when you just how you it feels so deliberate the way that you present them, and how they all interact. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it begins with the epigraph at the beginning. So this comes from an essay by Daisuke Miyao, who's thinking about the current state of Japanese um, cinema scholarship at the time of his writing, and he's mostly thinking about conversations that have existed within the subfield, and maybe conversations that are no longer happening or that we might be afraid to have. And one of the conversations is very much about subject position and positionality and identity politics, and the importance of that, and what that can do in informing our scholarship, but how also sometimes it can create barriers that we're maybe afraid to come up against, that we're afraid of the potential conflict that we could have by recognizing differences, for example, and that often we're instead of encountering them, we sort of are in the position of pulling back, maybe. And so I was thinking about this point of contact, about conflict, of misunderstandings, right? Yeah, like not meeting in the middle, but recognizing that there is difference, and that sometimes that difference prevents us from being able to understand each other. So I was thinking about that, and then I was thinking about that doesn't just happen from our backgrounds and our context, but that can also happen linguistically. In fact, it often happens linguistically, right? And then this really came to the fore when I was reading Ashizawa's piece and then trying to translate it. So there's a difference between reading it and then I'm comprehending it, and then having to actually put that into English. Because once I had to put it into English, then I had to make choices about the translation. And some of those words do not translate very well. And the active translation really also reveals how much I'm maybe kind of going with a vague sense of what she means, where I'm okay with it. But if I have to explain it to somebody else, then push comes to shove, and I have to actually hone in on a definition, and that reveals maybe that I'm not quite understanding what she's saying. And so some of these words, like the ones that I'm talking about in the commentary, I had to look them up. I looked up to see if there were English definitions. I looked up to see how they're defined within Japanese itself, and just kept coming up against this kind of, I'm pretty sure I know what she's talking about, but without asking her directly for clarification, like, how can I know, right? So this kind of friction between interlocutors, right, I became interested in. And then I wanted to try and represent that multiplicity in the video essay in some way. And so rather than just have the Japanese on screen, right, with an English voiceover or subtitles that translated it, I wanted to call our attention really to the language itself. Because I think if you're not a Japanese reader and you just rely on the subtitles, you could probably ignore the Japanese, right? But if you're having to listen to it, then at least like it's calling your attention to it. And by not translating some words, that also calls your attention that you're missing out on something too, and it brings the focal point back around to the Japanese. So I wanted to forefront Japanese language first. I wanted to put myself in the uncomfortable position of speaking Japanese and recording it, right? So a lot of people don't like to hear themselves in their native language, and lots of people don't like to hear themselves speaking a different language. So yeah, I wanted to put myself in that really uncomfortable position of actually speaking and recording Japanese, and performing it, right? Because it's not how I speak Japanese, it's a performance of it too. And then carrying that on with the English at the bottom into my thoughts to say, okay, I'm aligned with the English reader speaker in this. Actually, that's where I am. That's my stab at that question.
No, absolutely. And Ashizawa Kiko is a cinematographer, and one of the things that when I interviewed Alison earlier, that she talked about in the ethos of the project is, right, like filmmaker does not mean director, right? Like, and so in this project is really disrupting that in a lot of ways and looking at everyone who contributes an authorial vision to a film. And so I'm wondering for you, how did you think about that in terms of in the video essay? Like, does it change anything in trying to not center the director in a sense, as maybe most video essay or a lot of video essays often do?
Yeah, I mean, especially having her memories of a film, right? There's also another layer of like our memories of things and not the actual thing itself. But having her memory of the film and her articulate from a cinematographer's point of view how she's looking at a film was really interesting to me, right? Because, what does it mean to be watching film when you have that kind of expertise, right? You're obviously looking at things a little bit differently. We're looking at things as cinema scholars differently than, right, most of the average person who hasn't had this kind of training, right? So we're all looking at things differently, and trying to see through her lens, and then looking at her own films to see, well, don't you actually employ some of these methods after all, right? And so trying to find that was a very interesting process. But in addition to that, revealing how much thought and control is actually with the person who's behind the camera, who's putting maybe the director's vision into the technical expertise and drawing that out. Kurosawa Kiyoshi is famous for really not giving any direction whatsoever. So when you're watching his films, the actors are really just kind of coming up with the stage direction themselves and what they're supposed to do, and he just thumbs up or thumbs down or one take or whatever, right? So a lot of the artistic creation is not actually coming from the director, right? We attribute it in this kind of auteurship that we've now deconstructed as a myth, really. And so, yeah, it's very interesting to think about it from not the actor. We've done a lot of actor studies too, but the cinematographer as an expert of image science. What are they creating for us?
And so to kind of, close out the last part here, I just wanted to give, you've already had some great back and forth, but I wanted to kind of give you both the space to maybe ask one another a question or to say something else here. No pressure.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Sure. I actually wanted to piggyback off of what you were talking about, which is something that I love that you did with your video essay, just exploring, the issues around like translation and is anything getting lost when we're reading and translating and watching subtitles and stuff like that. And I think that that was such a big part of the project, and something I found so important was, anyone who was exploring something in another language, because it had occurred to me before, but I guess I never realized how critical it was, that if you're doing an analysis of a film and you don't actually speak the language and you're relying on the subtitles, they can absolutely communicate a completely incorrect message to you. Sometimes they're just dead wrong, And I think like I've watched some films in Spanish, and I'm just like reading the subtitles and I'm like, that's not what he means at all. You know what I mean? And I think that this project really sort of like opened up a lot of minds around like, oh, how should we approach dealing with foreign cinema if we don't speak the language? Like, why do I feel like I can do this if I can be here in this space if I don't speak the language, or if I don't know how to approach it culturally? And so I think like the whole project in itself is like a key part of this whole movement towards decolonizing film studies and everything that's going on in academia right now. I mean, there's tons of conferences, calls for papers about how do we do this. I think that, I mean, not to like toot our own horns because it was Allison's idea, but I think that the way that we have approached this project through Allison's guidance is kind of how you do it. You have to immerse yourself in it. You have to look at every element of it. You can't just, sit down in front of the film and say, okay, I'm going to analyze this film from this country and it's in this language, but I have subtitles and I know some film theory, I'm ready to go. Like, it just doesn't work like that. You really have to you know be up to your neck in it for it to work. So I think that this was such a good lesson in that, because especially working all of us together and talk, having some of us had group chats going or email chains and talking, or when we would meet in chat rooms, we'd be like, who's struggling with what, how are you approaching this? And I think it just sort of opened my mind to every single issue that I would have come across. Somebody else had it or I had one, and I was like, oh, I feel like I've experienced the whole gamut of really engaging with global cinema just from everyone else's experiences as well. So I think what I'm so honored to have been a part of this project, because I think moving forward, talking about decolonial scholarship in film studies, like this is a big part of the answer is this kind of immersion. So yeah, I don't know, I went from here to here just now, but I
No, but
really
I like this very much because I think there's an additional layer to language, especially when we're dealing with film or audiovisual media, which is we have been taught in film studies that is largely coming from an American, maybe also European context of what film studies is. Um, and we have this thing called the language of cinema, right? So there's, people are deconstructing this, of course, but like there is a predominant sense that even if film is being made in other languages and other cultural contexts, that we do share this sort of international language of cinema. But it's worthwhile to wonder to what extent that is actually true, right? So
yes.
if you have a cinematographer on set using a word like upsize, right? Like, and that is not a word that is operational, right? Outside of a Japanese context. And what does upsize mean? Does it mean a Xerox photocopier, like magnifying something? It's not a zoom, right? If the language on set is different and there's different technical words and there's techniques that are employed, is the language actually the same? And then taking that, in a historical context, like why is the long shot preferred in some national cinemas as opposed to others? Does it really reflect some sort of cultural essence? Or, are there sort of socio-historical reasons for why that is the case? Is the technology, sometimes attributed to this? So, the choices that are made are sometimes not actually choices, but material reality. And so I think it's worthwhile to also think about the illusion of the language of cinema, right? That we supposedly share, but maybe actually this is another point of difference that we've
Yeah.
taken for granted. So yeah, I wanted
No,
to end
I
on
was
that.
sitting here, I'm like, that was biblical. Like, it's
Oh
true.
no,
It's so.
no, that's the decolonizing project. But Krista, I wanna also comment on your piece too, because the title of your piece is in reference to the two sisters.
Yeah.
That's from the story. That's your voice doing the narration for that, right? I think, is it your voiceover,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So on that note of doing the voiceover, I mean, I think it's called Two Sisters, but I keep seeing threes actually. And it's funny that you even mentioned that when you approach something, you like to take three things that you like, because I was seeing lots of threes. You reference the past, the present, and the future. There's this falling asleep, the dream state, and then the waking up. There's the three films that you're using, right? There's the child that's depicted, there's the older figure, female figure that's
Hmm.
depicted, but then there's your voice as well, which is like a tertiary component. So it's interesting that the title is like two, but I really keep seeing three actually. So I don't know. I was just was thinking about the title and maybe how that was like a little bit of a red herring, maybe, instead of what actually was
Yeah.
happening.
So I kind of chose that because I felt like even though I'm working with so many elements, right? I also sort of wanted to like weave myself into it, not just by doing the voiceover, but I think just sort of acknowledging my shared experience, like growing up in this culture. And the way I sort of looked at it was in each film, there's two sisters, right? But kind of in reality, oh, it sounds so cheesy when I'm saying it out loud, but in my mind, I was like, the two sisters are me and Sofia Carillo. Like, we're the two
Mm,
kind of puppet masters of this whole thing because Carillo created it. And I am doing this to Carillo's work. You can't see me, but I'm
mm,
doing puppet fingers just for the podcast, marionette hands. And so I kind of looked at it in that way where, like, we're both sort of telling these stories. I'm using her work to tell my story as well, and so in that way, we were like the two matriarchs of this little monster project that I made from her work. So I kind of feel like I was maybe being a little bit like, I don't know, my ego got away with me. I'm like, I want to be Sofia Carillo's sister. But it's kind of, I wanted to like weave myself into the story as well. And I kind of thought of it in that way because, I feel like there is like a shared experience when you grow up in a certain culture, and especially like, my family, we're from a third world country. Like it's definitely something where I feel like that sort of, it lives on in you. It like passes on through your genetics, the way that you like react to certain situations based off your parents' life experience. And I kind of just wanted to be like, I understand these stories that she's telling. I can identify with them. They resonate with me. I feel like she's my hermana as well. So yeah, that was me writing myself into my own tale.
Well, I'm a spectator, and so now I'm part of it too. So I'm like, so these
Yeah.
are my two sisters. It's moving back to threes again.
How'd you do that?
I don't know.
That was pretty impressive. I was like, I just explained that whole thing away, and you're like, actually, there's three.
Actually,
I love that.
it's called being willful, I think, is what it is.
Yeah. Oh,
That's fantastic. Well, on that note, this really is just the beginning of a conversation that this project will hopefully, that this project will, I know, continue to have with everyone who watches these videos and engages with them. So, Colleen, Krista, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. And maybe you could each just plug share with us the names of your videos, and I'll of course link to them in the description below. And maybe I'll add this to the beginning of the episode. So, Colleen, maybe you first.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it was my pleasure to create the video Kūki.
my video is called Dos Hermanas. It's easier to remember just that. It's got a bunch of stuff after it at the end. It's just Dos Hermanas.
Fantastic. Well, again, I'll link to those in the description below for anyone listening here. And on that note, thank you so much again for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so
Thanks.
much, Will. And thank you,
Yeah,
Krista,
thanks,
as
Will. It's
well.
good to see you, Colleen.